Hi everyone, welcome to the second lesson in the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey's series. Today we're going to be looking at part 1 of the novel, so the first 140 or so pages. I'm going to pick out some key passages, analyze them with you, and talk about what they mean in terms of what Ken Kesey is trying to say, his overall message, and what are the themes that he's trying to draw out in each of these passages. So last week we talked about context. Just as a quick recap, context is everything surrounding the novel that isn't the actual novel's plot itself. So it's things like the history, it's things like what the author's intention was, what his background was. And I think it's really important to remember two things. One, this is a post-war novel, and in the post-war environment, there was a great disillusionment against institutions and authority. So institutions are basically any form of structure, a power structure in society. So it could be like a government, could be like a church, could be like a prison, right? That's an institution where there are people who dominate everything and tell the followers what to do. Okay, and also authority is just authority, someone who's a leader, someone who's a controller. So there was a great disillusionment, disenchantment with institutions because people began to distrust them after World War II because they were responsible for a lot of the horrors and a lot of the tragedy that happened during the war. Now, as part of that context, I asked you a question which some people have responded to already, which is really good. But that question was, why do you think Ken Kesey decided to set it in a mental institution, a mental asylum? Some of the answers have been quite accurate, and I want to just quickly go over what I think maybe are the good responses to that question. So I think personally, Ken Kesey decided to set it in a mental asylum for two reasons. The first one is that Ken Kesey realizes that the mental asylum is a type of institution that the general public is not familiar with, more than other institutions, even like a prison, right? So we kind of know how a church works, for example. We know how a university works, we know how a business place works, we know how a government works, but one type of institution that we simply don't have any information on because we're not familiar with it is the mental asylum, right? We don't really see what happens in there. At least in prisons, right? You have lots of documentaries and stuff made about prisons. We have lots of TV shows made about prisons. We kind of understand what happens, right? But a mental asylum is such a closed-off, closed-door environment from the public that Ken Kesey kind of wanted to illuminate and reveal what happens behind those closed doors to the public, given that he did work and volunteer as a night aide in a mental institution back when he was writing, before he was writing this novel. So it definitely draws from some of his own experience as well. But second of all, the mental institution is special because unlike other types of institutions, it's the most extreme type in terms of dehumanization. What do I mean by that? In other types of institutions, people can't control you to such an extent. So for example, imagine a government, right? A government can make you pay taxes, they can make you, not do certain things and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, like the Australian government or the American government, they can't really control you to the sense that they tell you, okay, you have to go here at this date, you have to do this, you have to do this, right? They can't really control your agency or your freedom. So agency is just another word for freedom of choice. Even institutions like a prison, like a punitive prison, so for criminals, they have some degree of agency in that situation as well, right? So as a prisoner, you can go out in recreation time, you can enjoy the time with other prisoners, you can choose to eat or not, you can choose to do this or do that. Obviously, you can't leave yourself, you don't have the freedom of movement, but for the large part, you're free to do other things when you're given the position to do other things, right? But a mental asylum is special because unlike these other types of institutions, it's the type that you have absolutely or basically zero agency. You can't do anything, right? Your entire schedule, your entire timetable is controlled by whoever's dominating you, whoever the authority is, okay? So in this case, that would be Nurse Ratchet. Nurse Ratchet controls the prisoners, where they move, who they hang out with, what activities they're allowed to do, what they watch on television, whether they get, sent to the shock room and have all this terrible torture done to them. She controls everything, and they have zero power to revolt. Now, why he chooses to set in here is it's meant to be a little bit of a satire, right? So remember last week how we talked about satire being like a political exaggeration of something as kind of like a joke, kind of like a humor, but it's also making political comment, right? So One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a satire because it takes this extreme institution, okay, this institution where people literally have zero agency, and makes it the subject of the story. And this is meant to be symbolic of a wider problem in society with institutions where people feel like, they're not the ones, they're the ones being controlled, they're the ones being dominated, okay? So it's meant to be taken seriously in the context of the novel, but you also have to think about like the fact that this institution is like an exaggerated version of every other institution in post-war America. So now let's quickly move on to some key passages in part 1 that I wanted to discuss. First of all, let's talk about domination, okay? So before we even get to like what Ken Kesey is trying to talk about in terms of madness and in terms of institutions, let's just talk about domination. So one thing that becomes really, really clear at the start of the novel is how much of a terrorizer Nurse Ratchet is and how much power she actually controls over every single person, regardless of whether they want it or not. So if we look at chapter 1, we have this passage from the chief, who is the narrator of the novel. I hide in the mop closet and listen, my heart beating in the dark, and I try to keep from getting scared, try to get my thoughts off someplace else, try to think back and remember things about the village and the big Columbia River, think about that one time Papa and me were hunting birds in a stand of cedar trees near the Dole. But like always, when I try to place my thoughts in the past and hide there, the fear close at hand seeps in through the memory. I can feel that least black boy out there coming up the hall, smelling out my fear. He opens out his nostrils like black funnels, his outsized head bobbing this way and that as he sniffs, and he sucks in fear from all over the ward. He's smelling me now. I can hear him snort. He don't know where I'm hid, but he's smelling and he's hunting around. I try to keep still. So what this is meant to demonstrate, and this is a great piece of writing because it inspires a lot of anxiety in the reader. It reflects the reader of Chief himself, right? Sorry, it reflects the anxiety of Chief himself. And what this passage is meant to convey to you is how much power an institution has in terms of controlling you, okay? In this situation, not only has Nurse Ratchet and her group of black boys or her night aides, not only has she been able to control people by controlling their movement, but she's penetrated the mind of these people, okay? They are so afraid of her that they are not free in terms of even thinking, okay? So they can't move, obviously, they can't escape, they can't refuse to take their medicine and stuff like that. But in this passage, Chief is hiding in the closet. He's trying to think of good things, but he can't. He finds that he's unable, he's not free to even think of happy things. Why? Because this institution has dominated him so much that he feels that he's no longer free to even think. He can only think of the fear and the oppression that comes with being in that situation. Now, obviously, coming back to what I said before about satire, this is meant to be a little bit satirical, okay? So, obviously, maybe in this situation you would be like that, but this is meant to be reflective of wider society. Sorry, I accidentally touched the mic there. This is meant to be reflective of wider society, okay? So in terms of like people trying to live in post-war America, right? They're trying to think of happy things. They're trying not to think of the fact that they're still in a Cold War with the Russians, that America has all these nukes and Russia also has these nukes, that they keep on waging these wars in other parts of the world that they have no right to wage over. They try to, cut that out of their mind and try to think of happy things, but they just can't because the anxiety under that sort of governmental institution is too strong. So I think that's a really key passage of the novel. Let's talk now about how she actually controls these people and how that reflects out into the context. So this is from chapter 2. Admission. Everyone stops playing cards and Monopoly, turns towards the day room door. Most days I'd been out sweeping the hall and see who they're signing in, but this morning, like I explained to you, the big nurse put 1,000 pounds down me and I can't budge out of the chair. Most days, I'm the first one to see the admission, watch him creep in the door and slide along the wall and stand scared till the black boys come sign for him and take him into the shower room where they strip him and leave him shivering with the door open while they all three run grinning up and down the halls looking for the Vaseline. We need that Vaseline, they'll tell the big nurse, for the thermometer. She looks up from one to the other. I'm sure you do, and hands them a jar, holds at least a gallon, but mind you boys don't group up in there. Then I see 2, maybe 3 of them in there, in that shower room with the admission, running that thermometer around in the grease till it's coated the size of your finger, crooning, "That's right, mother, that's right." and then shut the door and turn all the showers up to where you can't hear anything but the vicious hiss of water on the green tile. I'm out there most days, and I see it like that. So in this example, in this quote, we see how it is that Nurse Ratchet, as the authority of this institution, manages to dominate her people. And that's not actually using things like violence. Okay, I think that's really important to note. In this institution, Nurse Ratchet doesn't go around, waving a gun or a knife at everyone saying, shut up, you have to listen to me, otherwise I'm going to shoot you, right? She's not threatening violence, okay? She's not actually beating these people or using other forms. She's intimidating them. She's making them fearful. She's giving them anxiety, okay? And that fear is so strong that you're not able to overcome it and exert your own personal freedom and agency again. Okay, in this situation, in this particular quote, we see the fact that, these people, they are so afraid by these intimidation tactics that even though they desire freedom and they want to exert their own choice, they just can't, because they're too wrapped up in the possibility that they might be punished and that might be hurt by Nurse Ratchet. How does this reflect onto wider society? I think it's important to note that in most institutions, how people dominate others, how the leaders dominate the followers, is usually through fear and intimidation. It's not through violence. For example, the American government, right? And this was written in the time of the post-war environment. And one thing that I haven't talked about yet is the communist hunt that went on around the same time as this novel was being published. So what was the communist hunt in the United States? Basically, after World War II, the United States government tried to, use this campaign of propaganda where they tried to say that communism was like the worst thing in the world. Everyone who was a communist was an enemy of the state, okay? And they started just arresting anyone who might have been a communist and giving them criminal charges and putting them over a Senate hearing, okay? And this was a form of fear and intimidation, okay? Because even though, your only link to communism might have been, you had a girlfriend back in the day 15 years ago and you attended a communist meeting with her once, okay? That was enough to pin you as a communist, okay? And there was a great tidal wave of fear that flowed through the population, not only because they thought, communists were hiding out within the American people, they were going to sabotage us, but people who were basically not communists, who were basically innocent, were also fearing for their lives. And it's institutions like the American government who implement these tactics of fear and intimidation that they're able to oppress the people and dominate them and not give them any agency. So once again, this is meant to reflect the outside world as well. Sorry, I keep bumping into the mic. I apologize. So what's important now is let's get into this idea of dehumanization, okay? So one of the effects of oppression and domination in an institution is that necessarily people become less human than they were before. What does that even mean, less human, right? Like, how do you become less human? Well, dehumanization is the idea that when you lose your freedom, and when you lose what makes you fundamentally human, you actually stop becoming a human and you start being more of like an object, okay? So when you lose things like your own personality, your ability to choose, basically you're not a human anymore, right? You're just someone that's some plaything, some toy that other people throw around. And it's important to note that in this situation, even though these are human beings, although they have mental illnesses, these are human beings, right? At the end of the day, they have their own feelings and emotions and desires. They're being treated like objects. They're being treated like something to throw around. And it's really important that we note how this dehumanization happens. So, in this passage from chapter 3, across the room from the acutes are the coals of the combine's product, the chronics. Not in the hospital these to get fixed, but just to keep them from walking around the streets giving the product a bad name. Chronics are in for good, the staff concedes. Chronics are divided into walkers like me, can still get around if you keep them fed, and wheelers and vegetables. What the chronics are, or most of us, are machines with flaws inside that can't be repaired. Flaws born in or flaws beaten over so many years of the guy running head-on into solid things that by the time the hospital found him, he was bleeding rust in some vacant lot. Now, what this is meant to convey is the fact that these people who are in this mental asylum that are run by Nurse Ratchet, they no longer see themselves as people. I'm a person, right? I have my own personality and my own desires and things like that. No, I'm a chronic. I'm a vegetable, I'm a wheeler, I'm a walker, okay? They just think this is my identity now. This label that my government, or in this case, the authority in the mental institution has given me, that's my whole identity now, okay? And this was definitely happening in the outside world as well. In Ken Kesey's time, as I said before, like, you were either a capitalist or a communist. If you're a communist, doesn't matter if you were a good communist, right? Doesn't matter if you, like, wanted to give everyone free healthcare and wanted to give everyone free education, like, you supported really noble, worthwhile things. If you're a communist, that means you were evil, you wanted to sabotage America, you wanted to kill everyone. Okay, that's not true, right? People can believe in socialism and not be murderers. They can just want, people to have cheaper things, right? That's like a noble aim. But in America at the time, people were being labeled like that. If you're a capitalist, you're a good guy. You're a true American, okay? But if you're a communist, sorry, you're evil. We want you out, okay? It's the same as in this situation. If you're a chronic, you can't be fixed. Is that true? Is that necessarily true? If you're a chronic, you just have some flaw that can't be fixed. Basically, we can just disregard you, throw you to the side of society, and not deal with you again. Is that actually true? And is that actually fair to people? Well, in this situation, it doesn't matter, because the authority is the one who determines that. Finally, I want to get into this idea of madness and sanity, okay? Madness and sanity, and the conflict between madness and sanity. Now, what's ironic in a lot of this first part of the novel is the fact that a lot of the times, the people who are meant to be mad, so the people who have mental diseases, the patients, they actually appear to be more sane than the person who's meant to be the most rational and logical, aka the authority, Nurse Ratchet. And I think this conflict really comes to a head between obviously the kind of like the protagonist of the novel, Mcmurphy, and Nurse Ratchet. Okay, so Mcmurphy comes in, he doesn't seem insane, right? He makes very rational claims, or he makes very rational demands to Nurse Ratchet. He basically demands that they're able to choose what they watch on television, they're able to have more freedom of choice, that they're not treated like objects, that they are more fairly and humanely treated, things like that, right? That they're able to brush their teeth and, dress how they want to, right? These are just very rational, logical, acceptable, humanistic claims that Mcmurphy is making. But every time Mcmurphy even steps a little bit out of line, even if it's for a good cause, even if it was logical and rational and sane, what happens is Nurse Ratchet loses her mind. She starts screaming, she starts freaking out, okay? And what's important to note is, well, that's clearly ironic, right? Because isn't Nurse Ratchet meant to be the one who is the logical one, who is meant to be the one who's guiding these patients to their healing process so they're no longer insane? That's a really important irony in the novel. I've got this quote now from chapter 15. This is just after Mcmurphy, makes everyone sit in front of the blank television screen as a form of rebellion. And we're all sitting there lined up in front of that blanked out TV set, watching the grey screen, just like we could see the baseball game clear as day, and she's ranting and screaming behind us. If somebody could have come in and took a look, men watching a blank TV, a 50-year-old woman hollering and squealing at the back of their heads about discipline and order and recriminations, they'd thought the whole bunch of us were as crazy as loons. Okay? In this case, it's meant to make the authority look ridiculous and ludicrous. Nurse Ratchet is meant to be the authority. She's meant to be the one who is the most rational. Okay? But in this case, in this situation, she's the one who's overreacting and being crazy. Okay, so how does this relate to wider society? Basically, a lot of what people thought the government was doing at the time was very irrational. Now, I'm not going to tread over old ground. I already told you about the communist witch hunts and things like that, okay? So lots of people thought that was a very irrational thing for the government to do because they were freaking out. They were doing this really crazy thing of just prosecuting people who they thought might have been communists with zero evidence, right? And whereas people were just saying, like, you know what, we just want freedom of speech. We just want freedom to believe what we believe in. These are very sane claims, right? Sorry for the cut there. My phone actually ran out of storage space. So luckily, that's actually the end of the video. So that's everything that I wanted to cover today. Your question as you head into part 2 is this. What do you think Ken Kesey is trying to demonstrate between the relationship between Mcmurphy and Nurse Ratchet? Why are they clashing heads? Why does he have this major conflict, and what is that meant to represent in wider society? See you next week.